If you grew up in the 80s and 90s, you probably remember watching PBS for shows like Sesame Street, Carmen Sandiego, The Magic School Bus.
Please let this be a normal field trip with a friend? No way!
But your parents might remember PBS for very different reasons. The debauchery of I Claudius, the dancing men of Steambath, and the outspoken gay teenager on television's first reality show. Ever since its creation, PBS has been the place to go for stuff you couldn't find on commercial TV. Educational, enriching, avant-garde, and often super queer. But in the 90s, it nearly all went away. Republicans hatched a scheme to strangle PBS and sell it off for parts.
This is the most serious threat to public broadcasting that we've had in the 25-year history of public radio and public television.
And they used a gay love story set in the bars and bathhouses of San Francisco as a cover for their greedy scheme.
What the hell is going on when the taxpayers are required to fund such garbage as that?
The shit hit the fan.
This is the story of Tales of the City and the fight for the survival of public television.
One short, concise, simple message to my colleagues. Don't kill Big Bird.
The year is 1970, and America has just launched a radical new experiment.
This is French onion soup.
The Julia Child series The French Chef is the first show broadcast on a television network called the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS. What made this soup so radical is that, until this point, American TV shows had almost always been paid for by advertisers, which meant the advertisers were in charge. Ad-based shows weren't driven by quality. They existed to get as many commercials in front of the audience as possible, which is how you get moments like these.
Let's take a Winston break. That's it! Winston's got that filter blend. Yeah, Fred.
By the 1960s, there was widespread concern that low-quality, advertiser-driven TV shows were so damaging to American culture and the American people that the head of the FCC, Newton Minow, warned that when you turn on TV,
I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
So a group of educators, producers, and Democratic politicians came up with a solution. A new network.
It will be free and it will be independent and it will belong to all of our people.
A public broadcasting service, funded by a mix of the federal government, grants, and member donations, so it could focus on quality instead of selling ads. PBS launched in 1970, and it was an immediate hit, with shows that you couldn't find on commercial TV. Masterpiece Theater, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, a weird puppet show made by a bunch of hippies called Sesame Street.
A, B, C, D, E, F, to Cookie Monster.
PBS aired America's first black variety show, Soul. They had science shows like Nova, National Geographic specials. They aired international shows like Doctor Who. And PBS had a surprising amount of gay content. Even before their founding, the experimental project that eventually became PBS, NET, aired a documentary called The Rejected. It was one of the first discussions of homosexuality on American television, and even featured out queer people talking about their lives. They had news programs like In the Life, dramas like The Lost Language of Cranes, Tongues Untied by the filmmaker Marlon Riggs. One of the PBS founders, James Day, wrote, "If what we invented bore very little resemblance to the commercial networks, the difference was entirely deliberate." Their focus on quality over commerce worked. Over its history, PBS projects have won literally hundreds, if not thousands, of awards. Emmys, Oscars, Peabodys, BAFTAs, the list goes on and on. But there was always one group of people who hated public TV from the beginning: Republicans. Ever since its founding, Republicans called PBS too liberal. They hated the things that made it what it was, that it was diverse, that it wasn't obsessed with profit, it couldn't be manipulated by corporate advertisers. In 1970, when it was less than a year old, PBS ran a documentary called The Banks and the Poor that was especially unflattering to Richard Nixon and his allies in the financial industry. Nixon was furious. He tried to yank away PBS funding in response. But he was in for a shock. Around this time, when Congress was debating whether they should allocate $20 million to PBS, they heard testimony from a producer of a new show on the network, a guy named Fred Rogers. Initially, the politicians sound a little skeptical about what Mr. Rogers is proposing.
All right, Rogers, you got the floor.
But as he describes his show,
we deal with such things as the inner drama of childhood.
They get more interested.
How long a program is it?
It's a half hour every day. I'd like very much for you to see.
I'd like to see the program itself, or any one of them, you see.
And by the end?
I end the program by saying, "You've made this day a special day by just your being you.
I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
PBS proved to be enormously popular. Harder to kill off than Richard Nixon and his allies expected.
Sock it to me?
And by the way, this isn't the only time that Mr. Rogers changed the course of American television. A few years later, he went to court and delivered testimony that helped legalize VCRs. We don't have time for that story here, but I'm posting a bonus video about it over on Patreon. That's at patreon.com/mattbaum. But even though Mr. Rogers helped save PBS in the late 60s, Republicans never gave up trying to defund it. Nixon continued to go after it in the 70s. Republican governors tried to defund the local stations. Reagan tried to cut the budget in the 80s. In the early 90s, PBS was attacked by Bob Dole and defended by a young senator named Al Gore.
A whale is in trouble. I have to go.
Now, this was never really about the money. As a share of the federal budget, PBS was always tiny, less than a fraction of a percent. Just a couple of cents per American per year. But Republicans couldn't let it go. Every time the budget came up for approval, they would try to drain it. And they'd always fail, largely thanks to Democrats who stood up for it. And that brings us to the mid-90s. PBS was about to turn 25 years old, and it was still in a precarious position. Its budget was coming up for renewal, and they were bracing for yet another round of fights. So, who was going to have to make the case for PBS this time? By 1994, there were some very talented people running the network. There was the VP of Programming, Jennifer Lawson. She chose which shows they aired and helped develop new ones, like Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? Ken Burns' Civil War. There was also PBS President Irvin Duggan, who just joined the network after running the FCC under Clinton. He was pushing a novel idea that PBS needed to establish a presence on this new thing called the Internet. And there were funding executives like Richard Carlson. He was a staunch defender of public television. And, by the way, if the name Carlson sounds familiar, you might be thinking of his disappointing son, Tucker.
Dad is pissed!
Leaders like these had been successfully making the case for funding PBS for the last 25 years. But then, in the mid-90s, something changed. The Republican Revolution, a disastrous election in 1994 in which Republicans took control of the House for the first time in 40 years. They swept to power with a radical agenda to defund federal programs across the board, even if it sometimes meant shutting down the entire government to get their way.
When the new Congress starts business at noon tomorrow, the Republicans will be in charge. And they are pushing an agenda that amounts to a bloodless revolution.
Republicans had barely been in power a few days when they launched their most aggressive attack ever on PBS. And it was all tied to the broadcast of a controversial miniseries. So what was this miniseries? It was called Tales of the City, and it was one of the gayest things ever seen on American television. Tales was based on a series of novels by Armistead Maupin. He'd grown up in a conservative family, and as a young man, he planned to go into right-wing politics. He served in the military, he got a special recognition from Richard Nixon, he worked for Jesse Helms, one of the most conservative politicians in the country.
Jesse Helms gave me my first writing job. He thought I was the hope of the future. The only fucking thing he's ever been right about.
Then, in his 20s, Armistead moved to San Francisco to be a writer. But he came to the city with a secret. He was closeted. Though, not for long. San Francisco in the 1970s was a place of incredible sexual freedom. Armistead started going to bars and bathhouses, dating men, finding love. He realized this was a life he'd been searching for. And he wanted to share his liberation with others by writing about it.
My writing didn't really flourish until I came out, because it's very impossible to keep a huge secret in your heart and be a good writer.
Armistead talked his way into writing a daily column for the San Francisco Chronicle. Not news, but fiction, which was once more common for newspapers, but by the 1970s was pretty unusual. His column, Tales of the City, featured daily short stories about a young woman named Mary Ann Singleton who moves to San Francisco and discovers herself alongside a colorful cast of characters.
Initially, he was writing for a San Francisco audience. His neighbors, his friends.
There was a huge influx of LGBT people in the city, and they weren't being written about.
Including queer characters made the publisher of the Chronicle a little nervous. The publisher had a chart of every character in his office.
And the theory was that it should at no time be more than 30% homosexual. It annoyed me so much that I had a quota.
But Armistead found clever ways to slip the queer characters in, sometimes by not revealing they were queer until long after they'd been woven into the plot. And his column was a huge hit. San Franciscans loved having a little story about their town to read every day, and they found the openness of the characters inspiring.
Armistead
has told stories that make you want to tell your story.
Eventually, Armistead had written enough that he could turn the columns into a novel, and then another, and another. The popularity of his books got movie studios' attention, and they approached him about adapting them to the screen. But there was one problem: all the gay stuff. In the late 70s, Armistead had some meetings at Warner Brothers, but they told him to dial back the gay characters, to make the main gay character, Michael, just a sassy gay neighbor, a minor, easily cuttable side character. In the 1980s, CBS wanted to turn the books into a series, but with straight characters only. Armistead discovered he could effectively end any meeting with the studio by asking if the gay characters could be allowed to kiss. In the conservative 1980s, as far as executives were concerned, that was simply impossible. There was some interest from overseas, notably from British producer Andrew Lloyd Webber, but he wanted to make some of the characters British, and Armistead said no. So Webber went to work on tales of a different kind. But then another British company came along, Channel 4. They wanted to turn the first book into a 6-episode miniseries, and they were just fine with all the gay stuff. In fact, they'd made other queer movies in the past, like My Beautiful Laundrette and Morris. That all sounded good to Armistead. They got to work. The plan was to film it in San Francisco, then broadcast on Channel 4 in the UK, and find someone to air it in the US. So, shooting got underway in 1993. But this was kind of a risky plan. They were simply crossing their fingers that they'd find a place for it to broadcast in the US. And when they approached the major TV networks, they got a lot of familiar pushback. What was the problem? Well, you name it. First, there was a ton of drug use, because that was pretty common in San Francisco in the 1970s. Weed, coke, quaaludes, even poppers. In church. Then there's the nudity. There's lots of it throughout. And once again, that reflects the culture in San Francisco, which is a long tradition of public nudity. Citywide events like Beta Breakers, and on the traditionally gay Baker Beach, which is recognized as a nude beach by the federal government. But one of the biggest problems for the network were the queer characters. Tales has a ton of interwoven stories, and one of them is about a gay man named Michael who's looking for love.
Michael Tolliver is a romantic gay man with a big slut side. That's me.
Over the course of the series, we see Michael break up with his boyfriend, enter an underwear contest at a gay bar, and meet the man of his dreams and take him home. That man, by the way, is actor Billy Campbell, who was a finalist for the role of Riker on Star Trek and wound up playing the outrageous Okona.
Now, that's sex appeal.
And of course, the Rocketeer.
I like it.
Now, Tales may look pretty tame by today's standards, but back then...
Even showing two men in bed together with the implication that they had had sex in that bed was a really difficult thing to do on television.
For comparison, in 1989, the show 30-something had an episode with two men in bed, which was written by Richard Kramer, who also wrote the screenplay for the Tales adaptation. And the 30-something couple weren't even allowed to touch. Nevertheless, there was still a huge outcry. Advertisers dumped the show. It cost ABC over $1 million. That sent a clear message to other shows and other networks. Advertisers wouldn't stand for all this gay stuff. And sure enough, for years after that, when other ABC shows wanted to feature same-sex kisses, executives told producers point blank they couldn't, and specifically pointed to the advertiser reaction on 30-something. So at a time when the networks were strenuously avoiding gay romance, Tales went way further than any other show dared. It's shot to suggest that the characters are naked when they're in bed. We see them kiss, cuddle, even exchange romantic dialogue.
I like you.
Well, don't stop.
And Michael was just one of several queer characters on the show, some of whom, no spoilers, might come as a surprise to some viewers. Not only was this very exciting and funny and sexy, but it showed a side to queer life that was almost totally invisible in media of the 90s. It carried a message that Armistead wanted to convey to people who had grown up like him, feeling ashamed of who they were.
You can succeed and be happy and find peace with friends, all kinds of friends who don't give a damn who you go to bed with. Most of all, though, you can love and be loved without hating yourself for it.
A heartwarming, affirming message slipped in amongst all the sexy, salacious drama. But would American audiences ever get to see it? It seemed doubtful. As filming progressed, the series was rejected by one network after another. An executive at CBS told them showing gay men with sex lives would mean they'd need to run the series with a public health warning. But then, the last week of filming, the producers got some news. At the time, most of the programming on PBS was selected by one person, Jennifer Lawson, the vice president of programming. She saw value in what they were doing, and she made a deal to air it on PBS stations. This was PBS doing exactly what it was designed to do, to bring cultural content to viewers that they couldn't find anywhere else on commercial TV. It was a huge victory for the show, for PBS, and for viewers who now would get to see it. But things nearly went off the rails before they finished shooting, when Armistead got into a huge fight with one of the actors. What happened? Well, since the beginning of the project, Armistead had insisted that none of the actors playing gay characters should be closeted. That wasn't just his personal preference. He felt it was morally wrong, harmful.
There are systems that have enslaved us all, and the biggest one is the closet.
Armistead had recently been through this with a close friend, the actor Rock Hudson. He had tried to help Rock come out, to use his platform to show people that being gay wasn't shameful. Rock had come close, but passed away before he had the chance to do it on his terms. I have a whole other video about Rock Hudson if you want to check out that story. So, going into Tales, Armistead worked out a rule with the producer, Alan Poole: no closeted actors in gay roles. It was fine for straight actors to play gay, they just didn't want any of the cast lying. That would undermine the whole point of the story, to show how happy and fulfilling gay lives can be. But sure enough, during filming, one of the actors in the cast claimed to be straight in interviews. Armistead had never said which actor it was, but his anger about it kept mounting. And finally, on the last night of filming, he couldn't hold back anymore. He got into a huge shouting match with the actor out on the street in San Francisco. It was bad. There was screaming and tears. With literally just one scene left to shoot, it was up to the producer, Alan, to calm everyone down so they could finish filming. Alan's never said who the actor was either, just that he's still mad about it. It wasn't the most auspicious wrap for filming. But at least it was filmed, and now it was time to edit and get ready for broadcast. That all led up to the airing in January of 1994. It was a big media event. PBS sometimes had a reputation for being a little stuffy, but now...
Nude scenes, sexy romance, graphic language, gay lovers, narcotics. We are talking X-rated movie, right? No, it's a miniseries right in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on PBS.
That controversy caught the producers a little off guard.
We felt we had made a beautiful, loving show about family and about everybody's right to search for love, and there was nothing salacious in it.
That put PBS leadership in a tricky position of having to defend the show before it even aired. Their argument was there's room on PBS for all different kinds of stories. Irvin Duggan, the newly arrived president of PBS, told reporters, "I think the excitement of public television can be increased by making sure it's a home to all points of view, to give all people a feeling of ownership and participation." Richard Carlson, Tucker's dad, pointed out that Armistead was a celebrated author, and he said, PBS is doing its job, trying to service its audience. Still, PBS anticipated some reluctance, so they tried to offer a compromise to some stations. They made a specially edited version, with all the swears edited out and blurs over the nudity. One of the actresses, Chloe Webb, told reporters she didn't mind being blurred. She said, "If I want to see my breasts, I could just go in the bathroom." That compromise was okay for some of the stations, but a few in the South refused to air it altogether, or they scheduled it in the middle of the night. One station in Tennessee got a bomb threat over the show. They decided to pull it from the schedule just 1 hour before air. Instead, the station told viewers, if anyone wanted to see it, they'd have to come down in person for a private viewing. But stories like that were mostly the exception. Tales aired in almost every market in January of 1994, and it was a runaway hit. It got huge ratings, about double the average for a PBS broadcast. For many PBS stations, it was the most watched drama of the entire year. And they were thrilled.
They went into pledge drive mode. Give us money so that we can continue to bring you groundbreaking, wonderful programming like Tales of the City.
Talks began immediately about making a second season, based on Armistead's next books, which featured an Anita Bryant character, adventures in a brothel, and a cannibal cult hiding out in a church.
They don't look like Presbyterians to me.
But unbeknownst to PBS and the producers of Tales, there was trouble brewing. Because the enemies of public television saw the broadcast as their chance to kill off PBS for good. It started with the usual suspects. Far-right conservatives who always made noise about the slightest bit of gay content on TV. Then there was Robert Knight, an agitator at the Family Research Council. After the broadcast, he wrote in his newsletter that Tales was a slick piece of gay propaganda, and he said that as balance, PBS needed to air a documentary about ex-gays. And then the most noise came from a guy named Donald Wildman. I talked about him a bunch in my video about soap. Wildman was a failed preacher who wrote that he got bored with his church in the 1970s and found that he could get more attention by drumming up moral panics about television. Wildman had figured out that he could sometimes get his way if he went after advertisers, rather than after the shows themselves, and it must have been galling that there were no advertisers to go after with Tales. Wildman already had a grudge against the producers. A few years earlier, Channel 4 had made a TV documentary about censorship called Damned in the USA that focused on Wildman and Senator Jesse Helms, Armistead Maupin's old boss. The documentary made them look so bad that Wildman sued to prevent its release. But he lost, it came out, and wound up winning an Emmy for Best Documentary. Now, Tales of the City had him worked into a lather.
The question is whether or not tax dollars, taxpayers, are going to be forced to help pay for one homosexual to have anal intercourse with another homosexual and to put that into a movie.
During the broadcast of Tales of the City, Wildman taped every episode and then edited them into a 12-minute highlight reel of what he considered the most offensive content. And I'd like to show you what that looked like, but this is YouTube, so I'll have to illustrate it with something a little more mild. Wildman gathered footage of all the drug use, every moment of nudity, every single gay character, and he sent those dirty tapes to every single member of Congress.
The shit hit the fan. It was amazing.
The timing worked well for Wildman. One of the Republicans' big campaign promises was making massive cuts across the federal budget. And they saw PBS as a particularly easy target, especially after it aired a show with so much controversial content. Americans in the mid-90s were still pretty hostile to gays, and to the Republicans, it seemed a safe bet that nobody would want to defend a network that gave airtime to a bunch of queer perverts, lest they be accused of being perverts themselves. The party had discovered they could raise a ton of money by running ads that attacked queer people. Now, with Tales of the City fresh in people's minds, Republicans had a prominent scapegoat that they could use to target both PBS and gays. And they wasted no time doing just that. Here's a speech by Armistead's old boss, Jesse Helms.
What the hell is going on when the taxpayers are required to fund such garbage as that?
Leading the charge was the new Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Like Wildman, Gingrich had a personal score to settle with PBS. He'd had it out for them ever since they fired his friend, a consultant and former Republican congressman named Vin Weber. Plus, there was one more reason for Gingrich and the Republicans to go after PBS. Newt and his cronies had close ties to the telecom industry, and they were salivating at the idea of selling PBS off to private companies. Among them, the conglomerate that would eventually become Verizon, and to conservative moguls like Rupert Murdoch, who was just months away from launching the Fox News channel on cable. The timing for that would have been especially disastrous, because this was right before the US switched from analog broadcasts to digital. Digital could fit about 8 times as many channels into the same bandwidth. So that meant, if they could bankrupt and sell off PBS, for every one station Murdoch acquired, he'd soon be able to turn it into 8. In other words, every region in the country could soon get 8 new Fox News stations. Not on cable, but on their basic over-the-air dial. The Republicans weren't exactly secretive about that plan. Gingrich said in interviews about PBS, they're sitting on very valuable assets, and he said they should sell that slot to a commercial operation. Other Republicans gave speeches praising media conglomerates.
Fine, honest telecommunications companies.
And making it clear what they wanted those companies to be able to do.
Who might be interested in purchasing or running or managing the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
So, in early 1995, Newt launched his first attack.
One of the things we're going to do this year, I hope, I'm going to certainly try to have done, is to zero out the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
His argument? PBS was a waste of taxpayer money. He called it a sandbox for the rich, a toy only watched by the elite. That threw the heads of public broadcasting into a panic.
This is the most serious threat to public broadcasting that we've had in the 25-year history of public radio and public television.
Irvin Duggan and Richard Carlson rushed in front of cameras, saying, no, PBS isn't just for the rich.
The people who love public broadcasting are the very same people who make up this country.
They pointed to studies that showed PBS viewers come from all different backgrounds, and that one of the biggest segments of their viewership were people who were low income. After all, that was the entire goal of shows like Sesame Street. It was developed by child education experts in the 60s who saw that when disadvantaged families couldn't afford preschool, their kids fell behind. PBS wasn't elite. The whole purpose was to reach everyone, including people who otherwise couldn't afford those kinds of programs.
We hope that every child in the country watches it, but we do make a particular effort to be sure that children from minority communities and low-income communities watch the program.
Newt and the Republicans fired back that PBS had outlived its usefulness. Maybe it was needed back in the 1960s when there were only a few TV channels. But now they said there was cable. If viewers wanted diverse cultural programming, they could just watch the Learning Channel, or Discovery, or Bravo, or A&E. Their argument was that PBS should operate under the same for-profit model as a commercially profitable cable network.
For example, Nickelodeon, which produces so much good children's programming that's being sold to France.
But Duggan and Carlson responded, cable couldn't take the place of PBS.
Privatizing turns out to be only a euphemism for commercializing, breaking it into pieces to be sold for salvage. Then what would be lost could never be regained.
For one thing, cable wasn't available everywhere. For another, it was super expensive. And the biggest issue, the ads. You can't sit your kid down to watch educational programs on cable without someone trying to sell them something. Plus, you can see what happens with networks like A&E, Bravo, Discovery, the Learning Channel, when they're forced to prioritize pleasing shareholders. Channels that used to focus on educational documentaries would eventually become known for shows like Honey Boo Boo. But Newt still wasn't done. He rolled out a new line of attack. He said, okay, PBS could stay ad-free, but it should only be funded with voluntary donations from private citizens, not from the government. As a gimmick, he even taped a message in support of PBS.
As federal funding gets tighter and as the effort to balance the budget gets harder, public television deserves and needs our help as private citizens more than ever.
Duggan and Carlson did their best to push back against that, pointing out it would totally destabilize PBS if they could only depend on donors, not knowing how much they'd have one year to the next. And of course, Duggan and Carlson's message was absolutely correct. But unfortunately, there was a problem with the way that they delivered it. They were extremely boring and tragically uncool.
Today's electronic culture of gangster rap and violent kickboxing superheroes makes it hard to be a good parent.
They just weren't good public speakers. But you know who is a good public speaker?
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is LeVar Burton.
This clip comes from a showdown on Capitol Hill in January of '95. A House subcommittee convened a hearing on the future of PBS. On one side, they had the top conservative media pundits in the country, a rogues gallery of anti-gay agitators and corporate interests. On the other side, LeVar Burton, the producer and host of Reading Rainbow. But he wasn't just there in a professional capacity.
I'm here today as a parent of 14-year-old Ian and Michaela Jean, who was just 6 months a day or so ago.
In his speech, LeVar explains why this issue is so important to him.
Television is the most powerful tool we possess for addressing social growth and change, bar none, this venerable institution of Congress included.
He acknowledges the arguments that PBS could be privatized.
Now, I make my living in both commercial and public TVs, and don't get me wrong, commercial television has been very, very good to me.
And he says there's a reason that should never happen.
Commercial television cannot, does not, and will not do what public TV does, especially and specifically where our children are concerned. Public television doesn't try and sell our kids anything. As you see, the only thing we're selling on PBS to our children, Mr. Chairman, is inspiration.
And he ends on a personal plea.
And I'll go back to California now and hang out with my 6-month-old daughter and hope like hell, Mr. Chairman, that in a year or two when she's ready for Sesame Street, that Sesame Street is there for her in this commercial-free sanctuary of PBS.
But lawmakers didn't have to take his word for it. Another familiar face came to Washington to defend PBS.
And that is Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers.
Remember in the 1960s, Fred helped save funding for a young PBS. And now, 30 years later, he was back with a similar plea.
It's such a crucial job for us to offer images of what's possible in this life, not in empty hopelessness, but in healthy, fulfilling ways.
Something that resonates with me about this speech is that Mr. Rogers isn't just talking about shows for children, but about showing all different kinds of people living healthy, fulfilling lives. Exactly what you see with Michael's love story in Tales of the City, which carries that message that Armistead Maupin layered throughout his work.
You can love and be loved without hating yourself for it.
At a time when queer characters were largely invisible and their lives were depicted as shameful or tragic, PBS was one of the few places where viewers could experience what Mr. Rogers talks about here.
What a valuable gift it can be when they find something that clicks with whatever it is that's healthy inside of them.
In contrast to the stuffy executives, Mr. Rogers was such an effective messenger, he got his audience singing along with him.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor, would you be mine?
Appeals like these were a wake-up call to the public. It showed them just what was at stake, what could be lost, and it led to a massive public outcry. Angry letters, furious calls. You can see the attitude reflected in the way that the news reported on the defunding proposals.
Would this mean robbing McNeil, making Barney extinct, and turning Sesame Street into a vacant lot?
And in the way that Democrats framed the fight.
One short, concise, simple message to my colleagues. Don't kill Big Bird.
And an even more celebrity appeals for public broadcasting both on TV and radio.
But does all things considered ever consider me? No. Nevertheless, I remain a staunch supporter of National Public Radio.
Republicans went into this thinking PBS would be the easiest target they could pick. Their whole gamble was that the public would hate gays more than they liked PBS. But they were in for a rough wake-up. Before long, surveys came out. It showed that 91% of Americans watched PBS over the course of a week, and that 72% wanted PBS funding to stay the same or increase. The public made their position clear. Hands off PBS.
We think that we have undergone a great victory in that the debate has shifted now. The American people have spoken. They have supported public broadcasting tremendously.
And the next year, the PBS budget actually increased. There were some small cuts in government allocations, but those were more than offset by new sources. But as the dust settled, there were a few casualties. PBS reorganized their programming department, and Jennifer Lawson, who'd acquired Tales for PBS, decided to step away and start her own production company. She would eventually come back a few years later to oversee digital content. Another casualty? Plans for season 2 of Tales suddenly dried up. Officially, Duggan said, it was because the second season would be too expensive. They just didn't have room in the drama budget. But that's not the whole story. The reason that they didn't have room in the drama budget is because Duggan scaled that part of the budget back in favor of more children's shows. Ultimately, season 2 and 3 of Tales did get made. It aired on Showtime, and then there was a 4th season on Netflix. But it's hard to imagine that the bruising fight over funding didn't play some role in PBS stepping away from the project.
I still am disappointed that that happened. Because I think they would have made them all. I think they would have done the whole series. And they didn't.
But that's not to say that the network avoided queer content in the years that followed. Just the opposite, in fact. There was more than ever, even on shows that you might not expect, like This Old House. The very next year, they went to Savannah and featured an interview with Lady Chablis, a Southern trans icon who was featured in the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil.
Well, I'm curious, Chablis, as to how the publication of John's book has changed your life.
Well, as you can see, it's gotten me on This Old House, so that's a good start right there.
And PBS invested in queer content for younger viewers. In 1999, they helped distribute a groundbreaking documentary called It's Elementary, about how schools can make safer environments for LGBTQ students. And today, you can find gay characters on tons of PBS kids shows, from Arthur to Sesame Street to Clifford. Plus, arts shows like American Masters, which ran a fantastic documentary on an inclusive ballet troupe, Independent Lens, which spotlighted trans teens, and Prideland, which follows queer stories in the South. The PBS that we have today is continuing the mission they've had since the founding, striving to create shows that enrich everyone's lives and serve the audience above all else. And although PBS is still supported in part by viewers like us, the danger of defunding has never fully gone away. Republicans still have it in their crosshairs. Just last year, lawmakers in Oklahoma launched a defunding drive, specifically citing the ongoing queer content. And now there's an even bigger threat. The conservative agenda known as Project 2025, crafted by cronies of Donald Trump, which calls for the complete defunding of PBS. And that's why, if you've ever enjoyed Tales of the City, or Sesame Street, or The Magic School Bus, or Masterpiece Theater, or Mystery, or a million other PBS shows, as much as you benefit from PBS, PBS will always benefit from viewers like you who stand up for its survival.
You've obviously been able to use the kind of television that we've produced through the years. And I go home to that neighborhood hearing you singing and seeing your faces Thank you.
Now, there's lots more to say about the twists and turns of Tales of the City, the time that Mr. Rogers went to court to save the VCR, and the surprising and sometimes messy early years of public broadcasting.
Please, would you open the damn door?
For all that, check out my Patreon, where I post bonus videos every Sunday. Patrons also get access to a Discord server where you can connect with other folks, talk about the TV shows, movies, books, music, and games that you're enjoying right now. You can also see photos of everyone's pets. Go to patreon.com/mattbaum to get started. Huge thanks to everyone who helped research this video, especially the staff at the Seattle Public Library, and to everyone who makes my work possible on Patreon. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have just one question for you.
Oscar, do you understand about some and more?
Of course not. But I like it that way.